Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Ola Eriksrud. Ola is a professor and physiotherapist, but also holds a position with a company called 1080 Motion. Ola and I are going to be discussing the 1080 products today in relation to change of direction. So we go over a lot of different factors and considerations for programming and testing change of direction, data for change of direction, and so much more. So we really cover a lot of ground in this hour-long episode today. Ola is a wealth of knowledge and information, and I really appreciate his time, and I was able to learn a lot from him today. I know you're going to love this episode. This episode is made possible by Isophit. Isophit is the season 5 sponsor for the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast and can help you and your athletes win more and hurt less. For more on Isophit, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Ola, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me.
For people who might not be familiar with you, or maybe they haven't heard of this amazing company called 1080 or your amazing device called the 1080 Sprint, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the great things that you all do?
Oh, that's a big question. No, 1080 stems from, it's rather simple. 360 degrees in 3 dimensions, and there you have a 1080. So it stems from the freedom to move. Basically being able to target different kind of movement patterns that is not restricted to uniplanar movements, isolated joint movements, but getting the whole body to move. So that's where the naming 1080 comes in. And so 1080 Motion basically is we've been around for a decade now, over a decade. And so we were early movers, pioneers in that motorized resistance domain, which in essence is you have an electrical engine. On that engine is a drum. On that drum is a line. That engine is controlled by a computer, and that's where the magic is. And then you can put that into different types of systems or equipment. And one of them is the 1080 Sprint, 1080 Sprint 2. Then we have the 1080 Cable, and then we have the 1080 Quantum. Basically, what differs between those systems is what kind of load you can impose or use, and also the speed. So think of the Quantum and the Cable more like stationary units that you have in a traditional clinic, gym, what have you. Whereas the Sprint is more of a mobile, where it's not as much force as you have with the Quantum and the Cable, but it's much faster. So it allows itself to be used. Like right now, I'm sitting in Oslo, Norway, and I'm looking down at the pool. We're using it down at the pool here. We use it at the hockey rink. We use it at the track. We use it, Norwegian speed skating team is using my Sprint tomorrow morning on the ice. So it lends itself to a different environment. So that's what it is, really.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how you brought up that 1080 itself is 360 times 3, 360 degrees of movement, 3 different planes. And it's so interesting because when we think about, speed training or training change of direction and that kind of concept, it's so common to isolate it into one movement plane, right? Like, well, we're only going to do the sagittal plane. Well, we're only going to do frontal plane to frontal plane. And unfortunately, that's not how movement occurs on the actual field of play or on the actual arena, so to speak. There's not really one defined plane of movement for any motion. It's always a combination of all planes of movement. So having the ability to actually train multiple planes and have resistance across those planes simultaneously, to me, is absolutely a game changer. I can't really think of any other way that you would be able to train those type of things under some kind of load. And it's interesting because I think strength and conditioning, the term progressive overload is no stranger to most coaches that way. But when it comes to progressive overload and speed training or progressive overload and change of direction, all of a sudden people look a little lost. It's like, what do you mean overload and change of direction? Do you mean I can actually load that? I can add resistance to it? And I think having the ability to do that can be a real game changer for athletes across a variety of different sports and a variety of different levels and disciplines that way.
No, I agree with that. And that's, it's the principles are rather simple. It's something that has been around for decades, it's like but when you have a motorized resistance tech, the cool thing is that what you can do then, obviously, is you can set the loads, let's call it concentric and eccentric. You could call it assisted or resisted. It's basically, we're talking about the same thing. You can set them independent of each other. And this is also where you will find what differentiates the good versus the not so good is how responsive the tech is when you turn it. Because then you feel different, some systems have a lag there. And it has to be very responsive, especially if you want to do, say you want to do eccentric overload. This is something that we actually utilize quite a bit. So in the eccentric phase, we have greater load than in the concentric phase. And then you want that transition to be very responsive. As soon as the person changes direction, boom, that load changes magnitude. So, and the cool part here, so you can dial that in, obviously. And then you obviously have the output that you can use for different purposes. Because with any kind of movement, whether you do a shoulder internal external rotation, or you do a Bulgarian split squat, or you do XL to decel test or a change direction, you can start to look at the different phases of the movement. How fast was it? What was the time? What was the excursion, the distance? What was the force? That could be over multiple steps or one single discrete movement. What was the power and what was the speed? So you can start to look at all these different variables. And I'm also very cognizant that we cannot get lost in all the variables because it should be data informed. So sometimes we can present all these data, but I think we also have to be, a little careful in that regard, so we don't overload people with unnecessary and, frankly, sometimes meaningless information. So we have to be a little bit careful.
I completely agree, and I love that you bring that up on the concept of data. Is from my standpoint, the 1080 literally allows you to test the specific things that I personally, as a physio that way, usually see injuries occurring. Change of direction in a deceleration phase, going from one way to the next. And while I love the hop testing, the strength testing that we do, we have force plates in the clinic, all that sort of thing, right? We have all these things, but all of that is very isolated in nature. I want something that actually allows me to test the data on the field where the injuries are occurring. And I like that I can do that with the 1080 for the things that would actually be where the injury is occurring or the things that cause the injury in the first place. We can actually get numbers on that. You mentioned that there's a lot of different variables that you can measure and track and assess from the 1080. And you mentioned that, it's really important to know what you're looking for and have your process or your framework of what you're assessing and how you're assessing it dialed in. What kind of things are you usually assessing, or what kinds of things do you see teams and coaches assessing when they're using the 1080 from that data-driven change of direction standpoint?
Yeah, if we're looking at change of direction, and this is actually something, obviously, a lot of my right now, I would say I have a rather large emphasis and focus on change of direction. I have multiple projects, too many projects going on where we're actually dissecting it and looking more detailed and more granular at different things. But if we take a step back and have like a little bit of a bird's eye view to it, I think if we think about historically, say you did a modified 505 or a regular 505 or what have you, what you got historically was just total time. And then you had some people started to use laser, and you see radar, and you see other things coming forward, which is great, because now you can start to break it down and look a little bit more, what happens in different phases. It's kind of like to me, a 505 or a modified 505 is a locomotive, horizontal change of direction, under loaded conditions if you use a 1080 sprint. We are very familiar with this from a counter movement. That's just, or a drop jump. That's just a vertical change of direction, right? So we're very used to these phase distinctions that we have from a counter movement jump or a drop jump. So then I would start with just looking at the different phases. What was the duration of the different phases? So if you say you have a modified 505, you have an initial accel to a decel, that is a certain time. Then you have that reacceleration. Let's say both were 5 meters, just to keep it simple. Then looking at what were the times of those phases and what were the ratios of those phases. That would be my first stab at it. You know, this is what that person is doing, because we've always seen athletes or patients that are favoring something, but we couldn't quantify it. We could see it with that train eye, and they were favoring it. They were kind of slower during that decel, but then they had so much in the tank when they were doing reaccel, it was not an issue. Now we can get that ratio and we can start to break that down. So for a modified 505, you could see, 1.4, 1.5, meaning that they're spending way too much time in initial accel to decel, whereas others will have 1.1 ratio. That being said, I can have a wonderful ratio, but I also have to look at the overall time, right? Was it a good time or was it a bad time? So it always has to be in the reference to the performance. So I always start with time, and it's easy also to explain to the athlete and most coaches these things, because times they have a relationship. If I start with early deceleration power, I'm like, okay, that is I don't quite understand that. So yeah, I think you have to think about how you educate people and how you teach, and then what becomes meaningful. So that's usually how I start to break it down.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
So it's a bird's eye view. Start with the big picture.
That's a great point, and I like how you kind of broke it down with that 505 example. And you're right, a lot of times we time it, but it's like, can we look a little bit deeper, just a little bit deeper on that, and look at the acceleration and deceleration considerations? And you can use that to then inform what you do from a programming standpoint. So I like to be the guy who always asks the question, why? So it's, I go out there, we're going to do our mod 505, and I see the athlete decelerates a little bit early. Well, then it's the question of why are they doing that? Then it's the question of, are they doing that, if I make them turn left to right or right to left? Like, is it the same regardless of what direction that we're turning? Or is it more unidirectional? Like, hey, they always do it early on this side, but the other side, it's fine. Then it's the next layer of what's the ratio side to side. And it gives a whole new meaning to the concept of symmetry. I think, a lot of people are familiar with things like limb symmetry index, and we look at, isolated strength, left versus right. But, depending on the sport, maybe I've got an athlete who plays baseball, and when they're rounding the bases, they always turn to the left. They don't run the bases turning to the right. So, just because I get an isolated limb symmetry difference doesn't mean that that's going to carry over from a functional performance standpoint. And I like the concept of actually being able to assess, does those underlying asymmetries that every athlete is going to have, does that even impact what we see from a performance standpoint? Because it might not change how they perform. And if it doesn't, do I need to concern myself with something that's adapted from the sport and not impacting the way that they perform side to side at all?
No, I agree with you, because then, that's symmetry, asymmetry, that's a can of worms for sure. But expecting someone to be symmetrical in an asymmetrical sport, no, that it just doesn't happen. People have a dominant side, for the most part, and there's always, and there's going to be, and on top of that, you have biological variation, so I'm not going to perform it exactly the same way the next time or the time after that. So I think asymmetry, absolutely. But this is also where you can start to have informed decisions. If you gather, say you're working with a team, You test and you get data as a function of time. You're looking at the team, like what do others see? And then you're okay, this is the quote unquote normal ranges, right? And then if you have someone who comes in, say preseason, you have a baseline, might be a little bit asymmetrical, and then they get an injury for some reason, and then you go back to it, and then the asymmetry is far greater. Well, then you have something to compare to, right? You're comparing them to them. And if you didn't have that and you expected symmetry, you're chasing something that would be extremely difficult to get. So yeah, having, being just pragmatic about this symmetry asymmetry issue, I think is a good idea. And I've seen, people that perform really, really well, and they're asymmetrical in their ratios. If you're just looking at the times, they're definitely asymmetrical. Well, one guy is a left winger and the one guy is a right winger. And if we're playing soccer or football, we call it. I'm not going to get into that football soccer discussion, but the point is that they might have their favorite pattern, right? They might cut off their right to the left. That's what they always do. And I always like to use this story, and it's Arjen Robben, who's a really good right winger for Holland and multiple teams, Bayern Munich to mention one. He would always cut inwards off his right, cutting in. That's even what he did on the warm-up. So if I put him on a 505 and expected symmetry, that would be utopian. It just wouldn't happen. I don't have the data to prove it, but the point is that is his behavior. That's kind of his strength. That's his, everyone knows what's coming, but they still can't defend it, you know?
Right, right. And to your point, athletes are going to develop those habits over their entire career. And
Yes.
depending on the sport, that career could be starting as young as like 3, 4, or 5 years old. So if you're working with an athlete 25, 30 years old and expecting symmetry after they've done the same patterns and developed these things over a lifetime, you're not going to change that. And if you do expect to change it, you're going to need a lot more time than you think to try and break, literally a lifetime of habits. You also mentioned a great point on the testing for the team setting. And I love the application of 1080 here. So I see a lot of teams testing a lot of different data on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. But a lot of the movements they test, to me, in my mind, could be a little bit more specific to the sport. Maybe we test like a thigh pull, maybe we test like, a non-counter movement jump. And those are all great. But again, I don't often see athletes getting injured in those type of positions or those type of patterns. I personally see a lot getting injured in that change of direction type of thing. So if I can actually test an entire team and then have testing data throughout the season as it relates to a change of direction type pattern, I'd be interested to see what kind of discrepancies we pick up. And, you might not have the answer to this, but I would love to see if there's any kind of correlation between what you pick up from a 1080 testing wise and then future ACL injury or future, non-contact knee injury, meniscus, whatever it is that way. Is there anything where it's like, hey, all of a sudden we saw a drop in performance on a 505, and next thing you know, guys going down with a non-contact knee injury or something along those lines, because you're able to actually assess the mechanism in which things are occurring here, which is very unique. And I don't see that being done a lot of times.
Yeah, and I think, like some of the tests that are done, I think, they have a place, absolutely. And I think it's a complementary role and a complementary function. And it's not like one magic bullet that's going to solve everything, because that magic bullet does not exist, in my opinion. It's the combination of factors, and it's the combination of things that together provide a picture. And if we think about one thing that's very important here is that change of direction, that's more of my physical capacity to, slow down and reaccelerate in a different direction. It obviously there is no cognition, there is no decision making associated with that at the moment. So that is not agility. And sometimes people confuse change of direction with agility because we have that decision-making component. And if you're looking at ACL and non-contact injuries, you see a lot of them, and especially female. And now we're back on soccer, but it's defensive, late decisions, late decels. That's where they're occurring. So we're here. We did a prospective team handball study, and we're still exploring the data. But the point of that perspective was to see, are there anything in their deceleration strategies that we could pick up on, or possibly pick up on, that could help us or enlighten us to some extent, and maybe facilitate us doing a better job in that regard. So that was our perspective there, because if you look at you're looking at knee valgus moments and all that stuff, and that's obviously the injury mechanism here in a non-contact injury. But we're usually looking at those 200 milliseconds around contact. Like, how did I set myself up for that? Do I have the resources, if I made a late and poor decision, to actually decelerate? So these are questions that are certainly open at this point, and I think it holds some potential. And again, it's not going to solve everything, because I don't think it will, but it could at least shed some light on it, hopefully.
Definitely, or even
that's at least that's the perspective for now. And this is the scientist in me talking now, right now, where we have to be careful with what we're saying.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's one of those things where I think the problem is multifaceted, and there's not a one size fits all approach. As you mentioned, there's not a magic bullet here or anything like that, but it is a piece to the puzzle. And it's a piece that I feel like a lot of people end up misunderstanding. I'm always surprised when I get someone, late stage rehab, who maybe did their rehab at a different facility, and how the concept of change of direction concepts in rehab after injury was kind of forgotten about and missed. And it's like, we actually need to progress someone through contacts, and we also need to look at those contacts and assess what their change of direction is like after injury. And if we're not doing that, then we're doing them a disservice, in my opinion. I think the stat is 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 who injure their ACL end up re-injuring their ACL. And if we miss the change of direction approach from a rehab standpoint, then ultimately I think we do them a disservice. And it's not just training the change direction, but as you mentioned before, being intentional about what we do and why we do it. And it's one thing to go through the motions, but it's another thing to actually have the ability to add or remove load from them as well, right? How does change direction, that process of going one direction, zeroing our velocity, and then accelerating back a different direction, how does that process change if we add resistance from the 1080 to it? How much resistance should we add? Should we add 2 kilos? Should we add 6 kilos? What effect will that have? And then what if we actually assist? You mentioned before that you can change how much resistance or assistance we have on the quote unquote concentric or eccentric. How does that change when we're going from one direction to the next, whether it's assisting or resisting? Like, there's so many layers and so many factors to this. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that application piece of the 1080 from that change of direction standpoint. With all of that in mind, how do we go about considering how much should we add from a resistance or an assistance standpoint? What are our progression criteria as far as, should we add more resistance or should we take resistance away? And what effect is that going to have on the athlete when they do go to zero out velocity in one direction and then accelerate back the other way?
I think that question right there probably require a 20-minute answer, but I'll try to be brief. Well, then it's time for me to put on my physio hat. I'm a physio as well, so I'm wearing my Yukon hat, baseball hat today. Here are some examples. I think from a rehab perspective, I use the sprint very early. because there's a lot of good things that we can do in the gym, but as soon as you can get people up walking, as soon as they can weight bear, I have them loaded retro walking to work on terminal knee extension. This is the ACL example. If they can, start to walk toward, and this is where we have to think about, if I initiate the movement going away from the sprint or the system, we call that a resisted start. If I start going towards the sprint, that's an assisted start, right? So then we start, okay, slow walking, focus on deceleration towards the sprint, low loads. Then we can start to go a little bit faster. My experience has been that speed is something that they fear, right? So under loaded conditions, they feel safe. And that's been a feedback from multiple patients, actually. Like one of the big things she had to, like one patient, elite athlete, had to say was, it took the fear away. It was a fear avoidance thing. So when we used load to slow them down, they felt comfortable. So it was a really good tool in that regards. And then we just decreased the loading to allow the patient to get more and more speed into the movement. And then we saw that just qualitatively looking at it, and it's like, oh, she's not all that comfortable. And then we obviously communicated, and then we dialed it back up again. So from a deceleration perspective, then if we go back on that one, then I usually go gradually heavier and have them attack, faster and faster and faster with control, and then coming at different angles, right? Not so variability is a big principle. It's a big dial that we use. So I'm coming at different angles. I'm not walking straight towards. I'm coming at a little angle. I'm coming at a little angle. Obviously, when it's indicated. Then we start to get into running, an assisted start towards the sprint, starting to get into running, coming to controlled stops. But again, controlling the amount of speed that they're having to deal with. And then once they can do that at higher speeds, then they can plant and then they can turn around. And then we know that if you have sharper turns, change of direction, anything from 90 to 180 degree turn, that's a force dominant change of direction task, whereas just slowing down and reaccelerating like a tempo shift, that is more of a velocity dominant. So from 0 to 90 degrees, that's a velocity based change of direction, if you want to use those terms. So then we obviously change the angle. You can come in at an angle and you leave at the slight angle relative to the machine here. That's what we do. And then we play around with, if I'm doing a change of direction, if I do a resisted start, that means that I'm running away from the machine. That means that I'm unloading the deceleration because I'm pulling you. I'm making that force demand less if I'm doing a 180 degree turn. Whereas if I do an assisted start, meaning I'm first running towards the sprint is pulling you towards itself. You have to deal with that load, you have to turn around and then reaccelerate. So then I'm overloading the deceleration. So that's actually how you can think about how you start. And then one thing that I really like to manipulate, keeping the load constant and just playing with approach distances. And this is very important, I think. And this that I'm seeing more and more is that here you will see people or athletes or patients self-select. What kind of speed am I willing to assume to deal with? And this feeds momentum. Like what kind of momentum am I comfortable with turning off my injured leg or non-injured leg or left or right? And here you're seeing differences. The Vmax that they're assuming during that approach is going to be different, which is a very interesting observation. It's almost like a drop jump. I don't feel comfortable walking up on this height. If I take a little step down, I feel comfortable. So it's kind of like a self-selected. So I like the athletes to self-select a little bit. And then reading the data becomes very informative. Because, okay, so when you were approaching turning off your non-injured side, you were willing to assume this speed. Look at what happened and look at the strategy that you had when you were turning off your injured one. Then the data becomes very informative. And then we say, all right, let's move a little bit closer to the machine. Let's use that approach distance. See if you're getting more quote unquote back to the topic of symmetrical here. And this is also obviously where having reference data from preseason, for instance, would be very helpful. So that was a very dense answer right there. But I think, to me, slowing people down, feeling the ground, having to deal with the ground, getting that horizontal loading, having to deal with that, I see a lot of smiles because they feel like they're doing something meaningful. And that in itself is motivational. That in
Yeah.
itself is a big plus. Slowing them down, they feel safe. Fear avoidance, that is a massive positive. And then you play.
Yep. No, exactly. And you can apply that in the injured realm or just the general coaching realm, because I've seen a number of athletes where it's like, well, teammate goes down with a non-contact knee injury, and now everyone else is a little on guard, a little apprehensive, and they just kind of go through things a little bit different after they watch one of their teammates get hurt. So if you can reinstill that confidence through something like this, I certainly see a lot of value with that. I think that's a great point. I also love how you brought up the importance of overloading the deceleration phase. I think that's something that a lot of times is forgotten about, missed, or, just very difficult to do as it relates to the sprint. But having the ability to overload a deceleration and then push away from it, I think is incredibly powerful. And I also really like how you brought up the almost letting the athlete self-select, I believe was the term that you used, approach angle, distance, and so on that way. And then being able to manipulate that variable with the same level on the 1080 as far as assistance, resistance, that sort of thing goes. So I think that that's something too that, as you mentioned, you see where the athlete is at from a comfort standpoint, and then you can progress that distance over time, and you can kind of correlate that, I'd imagine, with distance and where you think they're going to be from a velocity standpoint, right? Like, obviously, if I give someone a 10-meter runway and then they're going to change direction, they're not going to be at top speed. They're not going to be achieving peak velocity at that point. But maybe I can back them up eventually to the point where they're 40, 50, 60 meters out. And by the time we have to go and change direction, we're actually approaching some of those peak velocity moments. And as we progress them closer and closer to peak velocity and out of the, quote unquote acceleration zone, if you'd like to call it that, that's kind of our litmus test of how close to normalcy I think we can be, especially if we don't have that background data or, testing data from past history or before injury or that sort of thing. Can we get them to the point where they are able to achieve peak velocity and then change direction comfortably? And then what does it look like side to side? I love that approach of almost progressing the distance back as opposed to progressing what we have as far as the resistance level goes.
Yeah, no, that's what we've done. And also this is where I think just looking at just know your sport, So, if I'm doing a change of direction, like, if I'm dealing with basketball, it's different than if I'm dealing with soccer or football. So for instance, we looked at this. So in a pressing action in soccer, like what kind of speeds are they usually assuming, and from which speeds and then obviously angular turns, but from which speeds are they having to decelerate from? Like what is that? And what is that in basketball? That is going to be less in basketball as compared to as compared to soccer, especially if you're looking at the first defensive actions of attackers that they are initiating the first level of the defense. So when we actually selected tests to be used in a football or soccer test protocol, Marta Buchheit and myself, we looked at, okay, what kind of speeds do they assume? All right, these speeds that they're assuming in pressing actions seem to be the speeds that they're assuming in a 1505. All right, let's use that then. So that like what the sports and the demands of the game. I don't know. I don't think you necessarily have to go to your peak or your VMAX. You just know the demands, and then you can change. That deceleration. If you're doing a 180-degree turn, it's very force demanding. So we're overloading that compared to what the demands of the sport is. So we're giving them maybe a little bit of a buffer. So I think that's the approach, at least, that we're having right now. So yeah, look at the sport. What are they doing? Is it short? And then maybe like greater late forces. And that's also another thing that we've done. We looked at the differences between, I had a presentation at the IOC conference in Monaco early this year, and then the comparison there was 505, 1005, 1505, and we looked at the deceleration phase. Like, what were the demands? Like, what were their magnitude? Like, how was early versus later deceleration? How did they differ? And one of the reasons there was to just try to figure out, and this is important from a rehab perspective. If I'm doing a shorter test, the force demands late deceleration is greater as compared to a 1005, for instance, where you have multiple steps to distribute it over, which decreases the late forces in the deceleration. So that to me is, again, a first step to try to look into this and maybe use that to inform, like, how do we progress during that rehab, or how do we expose our athletes? That could be even healthy athletes. So that was one of my messages from that that little poster that I had down in Monaco.
Where does this fit in as far as application standpoint? Rehab, training and conditioning, strength and conditioning that way. Do you have a 1080 day programmed, or is this something that athletes are using every single day, every single time they step in? Do you have any kind of parameters that you like as far as volume with the 1080 goes? Like, is there a point where, we start to see diminishing returns, especially with the overloaded decelerations? And are you pairing overloaded decels with lighter days as far as other activity goes, or do you want that to be on a heavier day? Walk me through just in general. You can rephrase this however you want. Walk me through in general the overall application of that 1080 and where it would fit into a rehab or training and conditioning program that way.
That's a difficult question. There's a paper coming out. There's a whole bunch of authors, but Damien Harper and myself is included in it, and it's called the Deceleration Framework. It has been accepted, so it's coming out, and it's a way to kind of provide some sort of structure. What can you do early, later, and then so you get a little bit of a progression of some thoughts of how you can do it. It's actually quite nice. Obviously, I'm biased. So, but no, I think it gives you a little bit of a framework, because we've had frameworks for acceleration, right? But deceleration, it's been lacking. So I think it provides a good overview. But you're touching on something very important here. Like, what are the doses that we provide? What's the frequency of that? Which is why we did a pilot this spring on this. We took a junior elite football soccer team, and we put it into play. The first big question is magnitude of load. Okay, you don't have a repetition maximum in a horizontal deceleration lunge or a deceleration jump, whether that is unilateral or bilateral landing. We don't have a repetition maximum. So we created a framework where we used RPEs and percentage of body weight to see if we could gauge something here. So I think one of the major findings from this little project, this little pilot, is that we found a good way of gauging the magnitude of the loading that you can use. And we used RPEs to actually get some sense of the intensity of that session and the exercise itself. So we did an exercise RPE and we did a session RPE every single session. So we have a good sense of that intensity, right? Then the next one, what's the minimum required dose? How often? So here we did one where we went from heavy to fast, kind of like following kind of like traditional acceleration perspective, if you will. So we went heavy, slow to lighter, faster. So that was our progression during that off-season program. And we put it into an off-season program. So we only had 6 or 8 weeks, 7 weeks. We could have put it into a longer period, but then it wouldn't have been relevant as an off-season program because this off-season is a given time. So we have to use the time frame given to us, and sometimes scientists miss that because they put it into a 12-week program, but the 12-week program is not possible to work because I don't have 12 weeks, I have 6 or whatever, you know. So then we did 2 sessions a week. That's what we did there. And the results, we are working on them right now. So we'll see what happened. But I think our biggest obstacle was just figuring out the intensities for the different movements. And I think we got a good grasp on that. My recommendation would be, and we're gonna come out with information on this, but use RPEs and percentage of body weight.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the application of RPE because you can apply that across the board for everything that you do. You can apply that to your 1080 work. You can apply that to your work in the weight room. You can apply that to your, sports skill practice that way and beyond. So I think RPE and having the athlete have the ability to self-report that is crucial. And I like that as well because we talk a lot on the podcast about all these other factors that impact athlete performance that we don't often think about. How'd they sleep that night? What'd they eat beforehand? Hydration status, all these other things. So you might do the exact same movement at the exact same resistance level, for example, one day to the next, and all of a sudden you see a spike in RPE up 3 or 4 points. That's when the warning alarm goes off and you say, okay, what's going on? What's going on that I'm not assessing and not looking at? Maybe it is just a load standpoint. Maybe we did a little too much from a physical training standpoint. Maybe we didn't do enough. But if you're not actually looking at that and you're not assessing it, then you're never going to pick up on those things. So I love the application of RPE from that standpoint. And I also like, you propose twice a week, 6 times a week. I think that's really applicable and sustainable for people. I think people can do that. It's not like this is a 6 to 7 times a week program. I've seen some protocols come out for different things where it's like, okay, yeah, you can, this will help, but you have to use it 3 hours a day. No one has the time to do that.
It's like you have to have feasibility, right?
Yes.
Feasibility from what is possible during that training week. Where does it fit into that schedule? That's important. How many weeks do I have to do this? So that was our key thing here. Like those were our 2 factors. And I like to, at least I like to hope so, that some of the research that we do is, relevant to the people in the field. And I feel like they could actually recognize some of the challenges that they're seeing and experiencing. And we are at least taking them into consideration and discussing them, because I think that is very, very important. I agree with you, because sometimes, well, if you do this 45 minutes every single day, but it's not possible. You have to view it in the context of all the other things going on. So we'll see how everything lands in terms of the analysis. But I think a big takeaway for us was this is how we can start to address intensities of horizontal loading from a deceleration perspective. That was like a big takeaway.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that's an essential element. And it's one of those things too, where that's got a place in almost every strength and conditioning, every training and conditioning program I see. So as far as fitting this into the puzzle that is, programming for a team or programming for a 9 to 12 month rehab, like you're already doing the things. It's like we might as well add a load component to it, and might as well add the ability to assess the data that we see when we're doing it.
Yeah, no, and I've been starting to employ it. You know, obviously my son takes my sprint out and he uses it himself. So then I ask him like, what was your like how you know how heavy was this? How what's your RP? So I've tried with reps in reserve on it as well. But then they, at least him or others too, it's like RPs. There's like, how heavy was this? Okay, like how many more could you do of this? So we've been playing with both of them actually, because we use reps in reserve a lot. I consult with the Norwegian Olympic and Paralympic Committee here in Oslo, and reps in reserve is something that we use very frequently in the programming with the athletes, because they have to execute many things on their own. And it also creates ownership, so they know their own training process. So there's not someone over them all the time. So they have to take responsibility and ownership of their training program. And then they look into reps in reserve. And that's easy if you're doing like easier, I would say. If you do say like squats or deadlifts or whatever, then it's easier to get that one. It wasn't as easy when we're doing repeated lunges. You could say like, how many more lunges could you take at this load condition? Sure, that's one way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
So we had
I
a
think that's
lot of discussions on this topic actually, trying to figure this out. So we're not, because I think one of the biggest problems that we have, not we have, but sometimes from a rehab perspective, is that we're not loading enough.
yeah.
And it's an under stimuli there, so we have to go after it, and that could be done one way.
I completely agree, and I really want to echo that point. The amount of times people come in and they just haven't been loaded at all or haven't been challenged, and it's amazing how loading can move the needle forward in a positive direction. But
Yeah,
like we talked about before, it's a matter of understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it. How am I applying the load? How many contacts, and so on that way. So I certainly think that loading is essential and often overlooked. But again, it's a matter of understanding the why and the deeper meaning and deeper rationale behind it.
no, I agree. It's a necessary thing. Yeah, being able to move unloaded, and having the freedom to operate, and self-select and have different strategies to solve the same task. Variability, brilliant, of course, we need that. But then also being able to have that overload, and if you're going to get that stimuli, there is a certain requirement there. So we have to be aware of that, so we're not. And this is where actually having a sprint, and you can dial in, that was 15 kg. I had these kids at 30, and I was like, whoa, that's pretty good. They were doing great. So it's not be afraid, just instruct them. And also it's a new thing, when you're introducing this thing, horizontal loading, it's not necessarily so that everyone has done it before. So having them be familiar with it, having them be able to play with it, feel it, and then you slowly but surely crank it up. Get the quality of the movement in, as we always look at, like, are you doing it the way that we want it? Check. All right, let's load it up. Let's see when you start to fall apart, so to speak.
And as you mentioned, it's just building that extra buffer zone, so to speak,
Yeah.
because if you can decelerate with the extra 30 kilos, for example,
Oh yeah,
then
that
you
I
go.
wouldn't go. I wouldn't go like 30 kg. I just want to reemphasize that. That was not when that was more lunging, attacking the ground, lunging,
Okay.
controlling that eccentric, going into an eccentric iso hold, and then taking
Okay.
the next one. Um, from a turning perspective, that's when you're getting into those speeds, that's when I dial far down on the loading.
More like 2 to 6.
Yeah, I would probably say, yeah, 2 to 9, 10. But you can obviously go higher here, but then sometimes it becomes a teaching tool, because if you see someone who's standing really high and don't get down, don't get their butts down, excuse my language, but then they stand high, and if we get a little bit greater load on them, they get penalized so bad if they're standing too high. So they that creates the strategy that we want. And sometimes, if their trunks are like all over the place and we want to, induce a little bit more there, rather than using a belt force anchor from the sprint, we use a vest. So you get a higher anchor. And then you really get penalized if you're not sitting down and leaning back. So then it becomes a teaching tool. It becomes a biofeedback, and they feel it and they figure it out without you actually having to say so much. Okay, let's try it with this high force anchor. And then you just ask them, what happened? Well, that didn't go that well. Well, all right, let's do it one more time. Let's see if we can do it better. And then you see people figuring it out without you giving them A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on and so forth instructions. They figure it out. So sometimes I have a tendency to talk too much, but that's when I try to be quiet and have them figure it out.
Yeah, and I think that's an essential element too, is, that language of coaching, so to speak. So often I see people over cue, and it's like you just gave your athlete 12 cues, they're not going to remember any of them.
No.
So if you can simplify it to the point of they can literally feel what they have to do, and then they're going to go through the motion, and then they're going to repeat it over and over and over again. Well, that's a lot more straightforward, and it's going to have a lot better carryover, in my opinion, than trying to cue someone through a process of 12 to 15 cues when, they're probably not going to remember more than half of them.
If that, they're probably one,
if best.
and this is where we have a very, very basic, I've worked with the technique and motor control coordination group up at the Olympic Center, and we have our philosophy and our model that we work by. We actually had like an English podcast on this a long time ago, but that would be an interesting one actually, because in the centerpiece here is the individual, the task, and the environment, right? That's the centerpiece. So it's basic motor learning, motor control. So this is when we turn different dials based upon the task. We turn dials in the environment, and then we turn dials relative to the individual, right? So it's almost like a big mixing table. That's actually the thought process we had when we created it. Like, which dials do we turn and why? And are we manipulating the task? Are we manipulating the environment? Like, what kind of conditions are we manipulating? Just to keep ourselves also very honest in terms of, if we're turning all the dials at the same time, we're going to have a problem, because then we have no idea what we just did, So reflecting on favorite dials, and are there other dials that I could use more? So for instance, their approach speed, it's like we're changing the task a little bit, but we're not changing the loading conditions at the same time. We're just changing the approach speed. That's like an example, a micro of that model in play.
Yeah, I like that.
I want you to solve this. I'm just moving the cone. I'm not saying anything. I know exactly what I want. Then I go over to the data and I look at it. Okay, so what kind of speed did they assume? They didn't assume more speed, even though I gave them greater approach speed. Interesting. So then I use that. Sometimes I share it with the athlete, sometimes I don't. But that's info, right?
Yep.
And then maybe you have to, okay, so all right, so then you might change the task a little bit, or you might give them a little bit of instruction. I want you to come over here a little bit faster, right? And all of a sudden things change. You didn't say too much. We just gave them. So
get here faster.
Sorry, I went off on a tangent here, but
no, I like it. I mean, your point is extremely valid. Like, the cue becomes get here faster, and they do it. It's not, do this, do that, think about this. It's get here faster. Just do it. And they have the ability to auto-regulate. And I also like your point too. Like, ultimately, every person we work with, N equals 1 at the end of the day. So we almost have to turn every athlete, whether it's strength and conditioning, rehabilitation, whatever the setting is, into their own little case study in a way, because what works for one might not work for the next. So, looking at the data, understanding what's going on, and then being able to act accordingly based on what we're seeing is ultimately the absolute essential skill, regardless of if you're coaching or you're rehabbing someone. So I think that's a great point. And, I also feel like you and I could probably talk about this all day long until we're blue in the face. I think we've covered a lot of ground as it relates to change of direction with the 1080, but we're really just scratching the surface. So for people who want to learn more and find out more and check out everything you guys are doing at 1080, where can they find you at and where can they learn more?
Well, that's a great question. Obviously, we have a homepage and social media and all that stuff, and that's 1080 Motion and 1080motion.com. That's also where we share, some of the social, some of the stuff that we do. I could do better when it comes to social media and maybe share more info. Also, but some people are also curious, like, okay, from a scientific perspective, we have on our homepage like all the science that have been conducted on using our tech. People can look into that. How did they do that? Then we go to congresses. LinkedIn is another place. We go to congresses. If people invite us to come to have workshops, we do that. So I think it's tomorrow I'm heading down to Prague to the European Strength and Conditioning, the basketball association, and my talk is going to be change the direction from a testing, training, and rehab perspective. So I have 40 minutes to do this. So I'm going to have a short theoretical intro and then a little bit of a practical thing, and then hopefully that will stir up some thoughts and maybe create some conversations. And that's usually where the magic happens, when we sit down with people and we chat and we talk with them. So no, I think that would be some good areas to find info on us. You can look me up online, like I said. If there are specific questions, more than happy, reach out. Email is good. And you find that on our homepage. Just so you know, I also work at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, so that's where I do my research and also teaching. So reach out, and there are conversations to be had. But I agree with you. I think we're scratching the surface of what we can do and how we can change things. And then some of the things that we're thinking today might be good and some maybe not so good, but in due time, we'll figure that out.
Exactly. We don't have all the answers yet, but
absolutely not. And the people, I get always a little scared when I hear people saying they have all the answers, because that's I know nobody that I know. A lot of great people, but it's usually a lot of questions.
There's certainly this thing they call the Dunning-Kruger effect, and the more time you spend doing something, whether that's performance coaching or rehab or whatever that way, the more you start to realize, well, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. And maybe there's a lot more to this than I originally thought. And I think the same is true with change of direction, and the same is true as far as how you apply a tool, whether that's the 1080 or any of these other tools that exist on the market, from force plates to, so on that way. There's ways that we know how to use it, and then there's a lot more ways that are going to come out over the next several years as we further our understanding and knowledge of it. So we are just scratching the surface, and it's exciting to see where this is all going to be in 6 months' time, a year's time, and so on that way.
Yeah. No, and a tool is a tool, right? So don't be, a tool fits some at some points at some times, and then other tools fits at other times. So you have to be, if the only tool you have is a hammer, all you see are nails, right? And there's a lot of wisdom to that. So don't become fanatic about a given tool, or there's so many solutions. I'm one of the founders of 1080, and one of the reasons why we did it is it's purely from my personal perspective. I wish I want this. I want to have this tool to be able to do this. So that's my biggest driving force in this.
We'll link to all of the things that you mentioned before from social
Yeah.
media and LinkedIn and so on that way in the description below as well. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there. Ola, I really appreciate your time and all the amazing work that you're doing in the research space, the physio space, and beyond. I don't know how you do it all, man. I don't know when you sleep, but yeah.
No, my wife is not very happy at times, but that's
Oh
how it
man.
is. That's how it is.
But appreciate your
No, thank
time,
you.
man.
No, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.